Hello again, and thank you for making the time to welcome me into wherever you are today. And I'm back in my backyard again. I wanted to explore the forest a little bit more, but it's a bit drizzly, and I'm reminded of our place here. And before we continue, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement of this place that we are here. We like to acknowledge the diversity of the First Peoples of this area, and to honor the stewardship of the Mississaugas, the New Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Senecas, the Iroquois Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat. Today, Toronto is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island and around the world. So we are very grateful to have the opportunity to work, to live, and to meet on this territory. Okay, so we are in the third week of Easter, and we come to a very familiar story this morning. And it's the miracle story of Jesus healing 5,000 people. And in my reading of this story this week, the story jumped out at me in a very visceral way, because I feel that we are talking about food, and food in our situation seems to be very critical right now. And with our city in lockdown and our country in lockdown, all of a sudden, the way that we see food, the way that we understand it has drastically changed. In our homes, when we look into our pantry, we open up the fridge, we consciously take inventory. We begin to calculate, count, and see how much of what we have, how much noodles we have, do we have enough vegetables, and we need more chips because we're watching so much Netflix. Anyways, I confess I'm hardly the person that does this in our home. In our home, it's Michelle. Michelle and my mother-in-law, they are amazing at this. So when they talk about meals and food preparation and supply chain, it's as if I'm sitting in a war room with them. So I know my place. I don't get involved. I just kind of eat my food and I quietly listen to them. So as they plan out our meals and they put together this list and they know which store to go to and what to get, it's quite a remarkable and strategic process. Now, if I was left alone to be in charge, our meals would be woefully bland. Cereal in the morning and instant noodles every day. Anyways, I'm very glad and thankful for the master chefs in our home. But I do feel that we have a very different take on how we see food and food security as a whole. Overall, I feel that there is more anxiety, there's more stress involved because we're thinking about it so much more. I think in the past, we were just so much carefree about our food. We just kind of go with the flow. But now we have to get ready. We have to suit up, armor up, and then we hug our loved ones goodbye, and then we brave the storm and we go out to get our food. So the opinion polls of Canadians have shown that most people feel the same way. And if they had a choice, most would rather choose not to go or have someone do the shopping for them. And for this reason, I think that's the reason why people have begun to stockpile and hoard. And this is a very normal human response in stressful times like this. And it's driven by anxiety and fear of the unknown, which we will talk about. So let me confess to another thing. In the first and early weeks of our lockdown, I was swept into this mentality of stockpiling. And I started to imagine that our society would collapse and there would be no more law and order, and all of a sudden it would be just chaos and anarchy. And yes, I confess I watched too many of these kinds of movies. So the first website I went on to was Costco. I had remembered bookmarking some items that I thought would be helpful in a scenario such as this. But when I got onto that page, I was sad and disappointed. Everything was sold out. Every flavor, every brand, every freeze-dried emergency food was gone. So I guess there are a lot of people thinking the way that I was thinking and feeling the same way. But in hindsight, I recognized that my anxiety had caused me to have this kind of tunnel vision. I was singly focused on ignoring all other things except survival and having enough food and stockpiling. So in our story today from Matthew 14, it centers on food. I think it's one of the more remarkable and memorable miracle stories, and it has really captured our childhood imaginations when we first heard about this story. And it's a beautiful story. It's simple, but it reminds us about deep lessons of faith. So Jesus had drawn thousands of people from the surrounding countryside and villages, men, women, children, and they all came out for different reasons. Some were curious, some want to listen and see, and some actually want to be healed by Jesus. So I love Jesus' response. Look at it in verse 14. When Jesus had landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. Now, I find Jesus' response quite profound in hindsight. The disciples, they had come across the Sea of Galilee, and once they arrived, they were met by a crowd, a rather sizable gathering. And I don't know about you, but I imagine, if you can imagine, how would you feel if in the morning you left your front door, and as you opened the door, and all of a sudden, all of your neighbors are there. Every single one of your neighbors are standing there, and they want something from you. How would you feel? I would feel overwhelmed. I would be speechless. I would be afraid. I wouldn't be able to help all of them. But Jesus' response, he had compassion on them, and he healed the sick. So this response of compassion, I think, allowed Jesus to kind of bypass beyond the numbers. He looked beyond the crowd, and he saw each individual person as they are. He peered into their hearts, and he met them where they were. So he comes beside them. He kneels beside them. He listens to them, and he touches them and brings them healing. Just like the time when Jesus healed the man with leprosy. Jesus dared to cross the line. He disobeyed law and convention, and he did something unthinkable. He disobeyed social distancing, and he gave human touch. He touched the man who was supposed to be untouchable. He gave compassion, and he offered the man healing. So think about this. Jesus could have healed anyone from far, from a distance, but he didn't. He came beside them to be with his people. And this is what compassion looks like. It's more than intellectual compassion or moral compassion. It's the kind of emotion that's deep down. It emerges from your soul that you have to do something and be with them. So I think this teaches us about people that are in need and help. How do we help them? Now our story gets even more interesting because now it's near the end of the day. Let's look at verse 15. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place. It's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves something to eat, some food." And Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." So it's evening, it's dinner time, but all of a sudden these people are all still there. And this is when the problem emerges. You have 5,000 men plus women and children in a remote area. Where will they find food? Okay, it's not a simple problem, but it really depends on how you look at it. So how would you look at the problem? How would you answer Jesus? I know what I would have done. I would have approached it in a rational way. I would have said, "Jesus, no offense, but look around. There's nothing here. We're in a remote place. We barely have enough food for ourselves, and we don't have enough money. And even if we did, there's no place to buy it. So we have nothing to offer. Just send them home." Simple. And I think this is how most people looked at it and how most people would assess the situation. And this is exactly how Philip responded. In John's account in chapter 6, verse 7, he says, "It would take more than a half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have just one bite." So Philip wasn't wrong. He did the math. bread for 15,000 plus people, it's going to take a big fat check, which they don't have. So I get it. This is normal. This is a rational human response. Sorry, Jesus, you're asking the impossible. We can't. We can't do it. There's not enough. So well then, something happens next. Some food emerges. 2 small fishes and 5 barley loaves. And according to John, it was a little boy that came forward with this. So 2 fishes, 5 barley loaves. And when the disciples saw this, I'm probably sure they thought it was cute. It was an innocent gesture, but it was too little, too late, too scarce. Scarcity means not enough. Excessive demand, little inventory leads to scarcity. And scarcity is the way that most humans think. And this situation that we're in right now, it feels very real. When you look at your fridge, all of a sudden, scarcity. We better get out there and get that thing and get those eggs before they run out. And so many of our frontline workers, they don't have enough. There's not enough PPE to go around. So why do we think this way? Well, psychologists tell us that when our minds are at threat, there's limited cognitive space. We have limited bandwidth. It gets very narrow when we're in a threatening situation. So we quickly summarize this situation and it leads to sort of a tunnel vision. It's low bandwidth. You focus on that one thing. Get what you need before others get it. Protect your stuff and hold on to your resources. So when we feel afraid, our bandwidth goes down. Fear, anxiety, and we look at only one option. We can't see the other options. French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, he observed that scarcity is the overruling approach to life. And he reflects upon different philosophies. He looks at Marxism, Aristotle, Plato, and Kant, and he concludes that the fundamental issue for human existence is scarcity. But this way of thinking is a myth. We've talked about this before. It's a construct, and it's really not true. Scarcity, for the most part, is driven by human greed and capitalism. Lynn Twist, she writes a book, The Soul of Money. She identifies 3 core myths that locks us into this economy of scarcity. First, there's not enough to go around. Second, somebody's going to be left out. Third, more is better. So let's think about that. If there's not enough to go around, then it would seem reasonable and unavoidable that you look at your own needs at the expense of others. Or the third one, more is better. If more is better, then it's perfectly okay to exploit our earth or to justify violence and greed. So you see, when we come to accept these myths, there's not enough to go around, someone's going to be left out, more is better. If we live this way, then our society will become unlivable. It will collapse. It will be an unbearable place to live. But don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that the world has infinite resources. This, of course, is untrue. But with the allotted amount of resources that God has given to us, we have enough. There's enough clean water. There's enough food. There's enough medicine. There's enough to go around if we choose it. This has always been the case if we open up our hearts and eyes to God. For example, do you remember these? Yes, Beanie Babies. Some of you still own one, and they keep you company at nighttime. And this is a classic example of manufactured scarcity. These cute, furry little things became the rage in the mid-90s, and they became the first internet toy sensation. And they became the toy to have, to own, to collect. And the company, Warner, they decided to increase market value, so they artificially drove the demand up. How? What did they do? They started to retire certain bears, and all of a sudden there was a scarcity, and all the prices overnight skyrocketed. And people, They were willing to pay thousands of dollars just for one. Again, a classic example of manufactured scarcity leading to tunnel vision. Another example. If you own a diamond, then very likely it was sold by the De Beers Diamond Company. And for a very, very long time, De Beers had a global economy or a global monopoly on diamonds. How? Well, they controlled it artificially and they inflated the cost of diamonds. They did this by buying as many diamonds as they could from all over the globe and kept it and locked them up into vaults. And of course, this created a situation of limited amounts of diamonds, and it created scarcity. We think there isn't enough and it's very precious, but actually they are affordable. They just kept everything to themselves. And this propagated, again, scarcity. Final example, which I think hits home, our food production, our supply chain. And at this time, everyone feels a little bit worried. We're all feeling some sort of anxiety about food production and food processing and food growing. But there's another reality. There is actually an abundance of food in Canada. There is. There's more than enough food for every man, woman, and child in Canada. But here's the ironic statistic. 1 out of 8 Canadian families struggle to put food on the table. And over 800,000 people will go to the food banks every month. So it doesn't make sense. How can we have a lot of food, but yet people don't have enough to eat? Well, there are many factors that come into play, and it's a complex problem. But here's a very sobering statistic. Every single year, Canada has a $31 billion food waste problem. $31 billion of food wasted every year. And can you guess where the food is most wasted? Is it on the collection or processing? The most of the food is wasted in our homes, from our fridges, from our plates. About 47% of food wastage comes from consumers like you and me. And that works out to be about $28 of food every week, or over a year, it's about $1,400. So from this perspective, it looks like our fears and our anxieties are created by us. So let's go back to our story. The disciples, they had a narrow bandwidth because they were overwhelmed with the situation. But look at how Jesus responds with the limited resources they had. Verse 18, "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. And calmly, Jesus took the little, the few, he looked up to God and gave thanks. He thanked God for the little that was there and blessed it. So notice, he gave thanks before the miracle. This was gratitude before the feasting. This was appreciation to God before the abundance. And Jesus takes what is given, and look what he does. Thousands are fed. Everyone had their fill. Stomachs are full. And in the end, it wasn't just enough. There was an abundance. There was 12 baskets left over. So you see, when Jesus gets involved, there's always enough. Jesus never worried about a lack of resources or enough time or food. He didn't make a decision based on the position of scarcity, but from the perspective of God's grace and abundance. If we look to the cross, the sacrifice that Jesus made was from God's abundance, his abundant love and mercy for you and me, enough grace to forgive everyone of their sins. So over and over again, I think we fall to this temptation of fear. We're afraid we won't have enough. So we feel this conflict over and over again. We say we believe in the reality of God's abundance, but we keep falling into this temptation of self-sufficiency. And I think we need to confess, and I confess, I'm always or often torn by our loyalties. I believe in the goodness of God, but I'm constantly tempted to buy into society's myth that there isn't enough. So this causes us to always second guess, just like the disciples. When we feel overwhelmed, it makes us worried and we become unneighborly. But we can move out of this tunnel vision mentality by looking to Jesus. Whenever we involve Him, there is abundance. He allows us to see things in a creative way, things that we never saw before. So we have to ask God to have eyes of faith over and over again. And then we see His abundance. It's really about letting go. Letting go, surrendering our imagined control. Our lives, our situation is really in the hands of God. It always has been. It always will be. No matter how much I think or you think that you're in control, we don't actually control that much. It is God who gives you and me breath and life. So we have to trust God with all things. A 20-year-old young man, his name was Mahesh Jena. He was in a situation in India. So what had happened was the lockdown in India has caused a tremendous amount of grief for many of the immigrant workers. So many of the immigrant workers, they come from distant villages and poor towns and they come into work. But when the lockdown happened, no more money, no more jobs, no more transportation. So how would they get home? So this young man, this 20-year-old Mahesh Jena, he decided that he would go home. He decided to go home by bike because at work he rode 12 kilometers to work, so no problem. He could ride home. But his home was 1,700 kilometers away. That's like the distance from here to Halifax. He didn't know how long it would take. He thought maybe a month, maybe a half a month, but it really didn't matter because he just wanted to get home. Because last year his father, he had kidney disease and he had an illness which didn't allow him to work, and he also has 2 younger brothers and a sister. So he had to leave school to make money for his family. But his friends, they told him, "You're crazy. This is impossible. You can't ride that far." But he wasn't deterred, and he just set off. He set off with a small backpack. He only had 3,000 rupee, which is about 55 Canadian dollars. And in his backpack, he had a change of clothes, a bar of soap, and a small blanket. And he didn't have a phone. He didn't have a spare tire. He didn't even have a map. So his plan was very simple. Just go by memory. Go by memory of how he arrived by train. So he rode. And he rode, and it was very hot, he said. So he rode mostly in the later afternoon, and sometimes he rode all night. And for hours he would ride down these dusty roads, trying to remember where the train went. And sometimes he would stop, and he said, "They let me sleep at the temple. They gave me food. They gave me milk. They even helped me fix my punctured tire." And on the first night, I went to sleep thinking, I've done 150 kilometers. I think I can do this. And Jenna said he didn't run into too much trouble. He was helped everywhere by people who he asked for help. And he cycled every day well into the night. And he said, "Nothing scary happened to me. I never had a problem with food or water. Even the police helped me with food and water. And luckily, I didn't have the virus. Otherwise, things would have ended up very differently." But then the tire punctures were more frequent. He had like 2 a day. And another day, he rode 100 kilometers the wrong way. And the worst day was when his tire completely exploded and he had no tire left. And he had to push and walk his bike. But people were kind, he said. They helped me. He said, "I was never going to give up my bike, even if I have to walk with it. If the train's opened, I'm going to take my bike on it. If the bus is opened again, I will take my bike onto the bus." I never felt sick, except the pain I felt when my feet and my thighs were so tired from all the long hours of cycling. And I didn't suffer too much. Sometimes I had a blackout or two, but when the pain was too great, I just stopped. Pretty amazing. He averaged 242 kilometers a day. He rode sometimes up to 16 hours. And some days, he said, I was like in a trance. And he forgot about the one thing that usually he obsessed about. Where would the money come from? So without a phone, He couldn't even talk to anyone or even take a single picture. But he noticed that as he was riding, the roads became particularly beautiful. And there was a lot of beauty, he said. I felt like I could ride alone, and if I died, it would be okay. If I lived, great. Day 7. Amazingly, he was on home turf. Only 100 kilometers to go, and he was almost done. And when he finally arrived, he was met by police, and they put him into quarantine. They heard about his story and said, "We must take your bike too. Anyone who rides this far can escape from us." Anyways, in the end, guess what he said was his biggest challenge? It wasn't the lack of food. It wasn't the lack of money. It wasn't even the fear of getting robbed or getting hurt. He says the biggest challenge was, keep my wheels turning. And that's what he did. So this is an amazing story of accomplishment on so little resources. It was meager. Everyone was scared for him except himself. The odds were really stacked against him. By all accounts, he really didn't have enough. I would be terrified. I would be thinking, I don't have enough energy. I don't have enough food. I don't even know where I'm going. And this would scare me. It scared his friends. But he decided to go. And he didn't overthink things. He just had his bicycle and his simple trust each day. I think Jenna teaches us something very simple and very important. It's this lesson of letting go of our perceived control and just trusting. Letting go of our fears and trusting in God. Allowing God to broaden our perspective and to heal us of our tunnel vision and fear. This, I hope, is the message that impresses upon you. Let's pray. Good and gracious God, we give thanks that you are a God of abundance. And in the midst of so much fear, we pray that we have greater trust in you. Many people are in need, and we have much to give. So move our hearts to those who have little, to those who are in pain, and let us be the people of God. Hear our prayers, and let us remember the abundance that we have through Jesus Christ our Son. Amen. Okay, we'll see you over on Zoom.